Ridge Whittaker was 37 years old. He believed exactly one thing about life. A man who builds something with his own two hands doesn't owe anyone an explanation. That belief carried him through 12 years in research labs, through a biomedical science career near Emory University in Atlanta, through a quiet brick house on a tree-lined street in Inman Park, paid for himself, one careful decision at a time. He didn't raise his voice, didn't chase attention. He worked, he built, he trusted the people closest to him. On an ordinary Tuesday in March, that trust ended in under 4 minutes. He got home a little past 7, lab coat folded over his arm, the smell of antiseptic still on his hands. The porch light was off. That was the first thing wrong. Amina always left it on. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he walked in, arms crossed, eyes red but dry, the kind of red that comes from crying earlier, not crying now. In that half second before she spoke, before everything changed, he still thought of her the way 11 years of habit had taught him to. My wife. A phrase that, by the end of this conversation, would never come to him automatically again. Her voice sounded rehearsed, almost recited. Ridge, I'm pregnant, and the baby is Jamal's. Here's something worth knowing about a man like Ridge before this story goes any further. Trauma researchers have a name for what happened in his chest right then. Acute shutdown. The body refusing to process information faster than the mind can survive it. He didn't gasp, didn't shout. He just went still. The kind of still that comes right before a man decides something that can't be undone. Amina mistook that stillness for weakness. She'd mistaken it for weakness for 11 years. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then, almost too fast to stop herself, it slipped out sideways. We've already talked it through. Everyone agrees this is the best way to handle it. Ridge set his keys down on the counter. Slowly. We, he repeated. How long has there been a family meeting about this? Your mother said there was no point calling you. She said you wouldn't agree anyway. The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Ridge picked up his phone and called Evelyn. She answered on the second ring, voice trembling in that practiced way she used at church when something needed smoothing over. Baby, this is a family matter. We're going to handle it together. In the background, Ronald's breathing. He said nothing at all. Ridge let the silence stretch. Then, calm enough to be frightening, he asked one question. So, I wasn't invited to the meeting? He hung up before anyone could answer. He walked into the bedroom, pulled the suitcase off the closet shelf, started folding shirts with the same unhurried precision he used in the lab. Corner square, sleeves tucked, nothing wasted. Amina followed him, grabbed his forearm, voice cracking open. Ridge, please, say something, anything. He didn't answer. Yanked open the bottom dresser drawer instead, the one with the old cards and photos neither of them ever looked through, hunting for his passport. His hand found something else first. A folded sheet of notebook paper, tucked behind a stack of birthday cards. 6 months old by the date scrawled in the corner. Jamal's handwriting. A letter to Amina. If he finds out, just put it all on yourself. Tell him you were weak. He won't do anything to you. Ridge read it twice, folded it back along its own creases, slid it into his jacket pocket. Not a man nursing a wound, a man filing evidence. You already have plenty of people to handle it together with, he said quietly. Zipped the bag. One slow pull. Walked out the front door. Behind him, Amina was already dialing his mother. Then Jamal. Ridge didn't look back at the porch light that never came on. Got in the car, pulled out of the driveway on Elizabeth Street, pointed the wheel north toward I-85. By the time the Atlanta skyline shrank in his mirror, he'd already made a decision nobody in that family could have imagined him capable of. Not his mother, not his brother, not the woman he'd, until tonight, still quietly called my wife. He wasn't driving away in anger. He was driving toward a life none of them would ever be let back into. What Ridge does in the next 48 hours leaves his entire family scrambling to undo a mistake they don't even know they've made yet. Stay with this one. By the time Ridge crossed into South Carolina, every number that mattered was already blocked. He did it the way a scientist runs a protocol, methodical, no step skipped. His mother's number, his father's, Jamal's, the family group chat that had already sent him 43 unread messages in under 3 hours. He pulled into a gas station outside Spartanburg, bought a new SIM with cash, changed his own number before the tank was even full. That was the first thing he understood about leaving cleanly. Silence has to be built. It doesn't happen by accident. Some people call what Ridge was doing strategic disengagement, the deliberate, unemotional dismantling of every channel a manipulative system could use to reach him. Not running away, closing every door, one lock at a time, so no one could later claim they simply didn't know how to find him. Most people who get betrayed spend months arguing for the right to be heard. Ridge spent one night making sure he'd never have to be. He opened a separate bank account that same week in a city where nobody in his family had ever set foot. On his attorney's advice, he set aside exactly half the marital assets, to the dollar. Didn't want anyone saying later he'd taken more than what was his. Not even from the woman the paperwork still, technically, called my wife. The insurance, the account separations, all of it moved through proper channels. Nothing rushed. Nothing anyone could question. He hired the most expensive divorce attorney in Atlanta and gave him one instruction: no direct contact. By the second week, he had a new apartment in South End, Charlotte. Exposed brick, tall windows. A view of the light rail humming past every 20 minutes, like a small, steady reminder that life kept moving whether he asked it to or not. An old colleague from Atlanta called to check on him. Ridge almost didn't pick up. Glad he did. At the company holiday party last year, the colleague said carefully, I saw Jamal and Amina leave together. Same car. Wasn't yours. Ridge said nothing for a long moment. Then, quiet. Thank you for telling me now instead of then. He hung up. Didn't call back for more, just added the date to a folder on his laptop. No name with feeling in it, just timeline. He took a job as senior research lead at a biotech firm off South Tryon Street. His new colleagues knew him as composed, precise, the kind of man who came in early, left exactly on time, never once mentioned a wife. Then the rumors started. A cousin who still cared enough warned him. Atlanta's circles were saying Ridge had mental issues, that he'd been controlling, abusive even. The story had been reshaped so completely he barely recognized the man it described. A message landed through the church directory app one Sunday night. Don't believe what they're saying. Sister Evelyn asked the deacon board to protect Jamal and keep this quiet. Ridge read it twice. Didn't respond. Didn't call anyone to set the record straight. Just saved it to the same folder where everything else now lived. This is the part most people get wrong about quiet men. They assume silence means surrender. It rarely does. What Ridge was practicing, some would call evidence-based patience. The discipline of letting a record build itself, undisturbed, instead of burning energy convincing people who'd already decided not to listen. He wasn't ignoring the rumors. He was refusing to fight on a battlefield his family controlled. It was at a Sunday farmers market on East Boulevard, 3 months after Charlotte, that he met Maha, 34, marketing director. An easy, grounded laugh. The kind of woman who asked 1 or 2 questions and actually listened to the answer instead of waiting her turn to talk. She didn't ask why a man his age was buying vegetables alone on a Sunday morning. Just pointed him toward the best heirloom tomatoes at the stand, and somehow that one ordinary sentence felt like the first normal conversation he'd had in months. They started slow, no urgency, No performance. Back in Atlanta, things were coming apart at the seams. After the baby was born, an attorney's letter showed up demanding financial support for the child's stability. Ridge's lawyer dug deeper and found something Ridge hadn't expected. 14 months before the affair ever surfaced, Amina had quietly taken out a sizable life insurance policy on him. Herself, primary beneficiary. A backup plan, in case he'd simply disappeared one day. Just a different kind of disappearing than the one she got. The rumors cost Jamal his job once they spread through Atlanta's business circles. Evelyn's blood pressure put her in urgent care twice in 1 month. Ronald, the quiet one, said almost nothing, until a single handwritten letter arrived through Ridge's attorney. Your mother and Jamal had already talked about it before you found out. I didn't agree. But your mother said, keep Ronald quiet, he's weak. Ridge folded that letter the same way he'd folded the first one. Square corners, no wasted motion. Some habits, he was learning, were just who he was now. He kept his distance, kept building. And under the fluorescent lights of the lab on South Tryon Street, lights that asked nothing of him but precision, Ridge Whittaker quietly became the kind of man his family had never once imagined he could be without them. Comment 1 if you'd have walked out that same night. Comment 2 if you'd have stayed to fight for the truth first. And tell us, has your own family ever asked you to stay quiet to protect someone else? Because what Ridge finds next will test exactly how far that kind of loyalty goes. Maha found the post by accident, wasn't looking for it, just scrolling one quiet evening on the couch, half watching a rerun, half checking her phone, when a comment thread from Renee, the old Atlanta friend who'd warned her about the Whittakers months before things with Ridge got serious, led her somewhere she hadn't meant to go. An old, half-deleted post from Amina, 10 months before the pregnancy was ever announced. Being taken care of by someone special these days, the caption read, under a photo of a bracelet Maha didn't recognize. The post itself was gone. The comments underneath weren't. Left by relatives who clearly never thought to check who could still see them. Girl, who is this? You better be careful. Does R know? Maha sat with it a moment, then turned her phone toward Ridge, wordless, and let him read it for himself. He studied it a long moment, set the phone down on the coffee table, calm, like always. It was never a secret, he said quietly, just never said to me. He noticed, almost in passing, that he no longer thought of her, even reflexively, even out of 11 years of habit, as my wife. That instinct had finally broken somewhere between Spartanburg and tonight. Here's something worth sitting with about a man like Ridge. He'd spent a year being told, in careful, rehearsed language, that the betrayal had been sudden, a mistake, a stumble, a single moment of weakness. What that screenshot confirmed was colder. It hadn't been sudden at all. It had been hiding in plain sight for almost a year, visible to cousins and old friends, invisible only to the one person it belonged to. Some call this delayed clarity. The moment a person finally sees, all at once, the full shape of something they'd only ever been shown in pieces. It rarely brings new grief. Mostly, it brings confirmation. And confirmation, strangely, can feel like relief. There's a lesson underneath that relief. The people closest to a betrayal are often the last to know. Not because the truth is hard to find, because everyone around them already agreed, quietly, without ever saying it out loud, that protecting the betrayer was easier than protecting the truth. The pressure from Atlanta hadn't slowed. If anything, it sharpened. This wasn't the first ask. The earlier letter, the one about the child's stability, Ridge had simply let go unanswered. This one was different, formal, attorney-drafted, considerably more direct. Provide support, or at minimum acknowledge the child publicly, because the baby needs a stable father. Ridge read it once at his kitchen counter, handed it to his attorney with one instruction. His response went out within the hour. 4 lines, no room for negotiation. I am not the child's father. I am also no longer a member of that family. His attorney was blunt about it, privately. No legal claim here, no biological tie, no adoption, no signed agreement. The letter was never really about the law. It was about leverage. It wasn't the baby Ridge was rejecting. A child hadn't asked to be born into any of this. It was the role they were trying to hand him. Pay quietly, smile publicly, let everyone keep pretending nothing happened. He didn't soften the answer, didn't apologize for the bluntness. Just let it stand. This moment is worth slowing down for. It reveals a pattern a lot of people only recognize after they've lived through it. Family systems researchers call it weaponized obligation, the expectation that the person who got hurt should still show up, still provide, still perform loyalty, simply because the role was handed to them long before they ever had a say. Ridge had spent 37 years being the stable one. That label was never a compliment. It was a job description. And the family expected him to keep working it, even after they'd broken every term of the agreement. The lesson here is simple, even if it took Ridge a long time to believe it. A title someone else gave you, son, brother, provider, the dependable one, isn't a debt you owe forever. You're allowed to resign from a role you never actually agreed to. Back in Atlanta, the consequences he'd quietly engineered through nothing but distance were arriving on their own. The rumors meant to destroy his reputation didn't fade. They invited questions. A few old colleagues, unwilling to repeat a story without checking it, started asking around. What they found wasn't a controlling, unstable husband. It was a brother who'd fathered his sister-in-law's child and helped script her alibi. The story flipped completely, and once it hit Atlanta's tightly connected business circles, it cost Jamal his job. Within weeks, under the weight of public embarrassment and money trouble, Amina filed for divorce from Jamal. The family that once obsessed over keeping up appearances at every church function, every Sunday dinner, every carefully posed photo, was now unraveling in full view of the very community they'd tried so hard to impress. There's a well-documented pattern in families built around image instead of honesty, and it's worth naming plainly here because plenty of people watching this have lived inside a version of it. Some call it the collapse of the cover story. As long as a family can control the narrative, the person who actually got hurt gets cast as the problem, too sensitive, too cold, too unwilling to let it go. But cover stories are fragile. They depend on everyone agreeing to keep performing them. The moment even one person stops, the moment Ridge simply stepped back and let silence do what arguing never could, the story those people built starts falling apart on its own. Amina found out about Jamal's firing the same way everyone else did. A cousin's group text. 3 exclamation points after his name. No context, no warmth. She sat on the edge of her bed that night, the baby finally asleep down the hall, and for the first time since the kitchen table in Inman Park, she let herself ask the question she'd been avoiding for nearly a year. What exactly had any of it gotten her? Not security, not the comfortable life she'd quietly assumed would just keep going under a different name, just a smaller apartment. A man who'd stopped answering her calls the moment his name started appearing beside hers in the headlines. A son who would, one day, ask questions she had no good answers for. She didn't call Ridge. By then she understood there was no version of that call he'd ever pick up. An old friend from Atlanta sent Ridge a long email, careful detail, almost gossiping. Who'd stopped speaking to whom, who'd been asked to step down from the deacon board, who hadn't shown their face at church in a month. Ridge read the whole thing, closed his laptop without answering. They want me to fight, he told Maha that night, 2 cups of coffee going cold between them on the porch. So they can feel forgiven for something. I'm not giving them that. What Ridge understood in that calm, unremarkable moment is something most people only learn after years of getting pulled back into the same painful cycle. Forgiveness offered under pressure isn't forgiveness. It's a transaction. The people demanding it from Ridge weren't asking him to heal. They were asking him to absorb their consequences so they wouldn't have to feel them. He'd already decided he wasn't doing that anymore. There was one evening, weeks later, that Ridge would remember clearly for the rest of his life, even though nothing dramatic happened in it at all. Alone in the lab on South Tryon Street, past 7, the building mostly empty, just the hum of the ventilation system. Through the window, uptown Charlotte stretched out in neat, orderly rows, nothing like the chaos he knew was unfolding 4 hours south on I-85. No triumph standing there, not peace yet either, just distance. The particular relief of watching a storm pass a window you're no longer standing in front of. 400 miles away, inside the same Atlanta church where Evelyn had once stood proudly each Sunday introducing her 2 wonderful sons, she sat alone on a back pew long after the service ended. Sanctuary lights dimmed, phone heavy and silent in her lap. She hadn't cried like this in years. She didn't know yet, couldn't know, that whatever she did next would be the very thing that finally forced her whole family to face the truth they'd spent a lifetime avoiding. What Evelyn does next brings this whole story to its breaking point. Don't go anywhere. Jamal's message arrived 2 days earlier, easy to miss, buried between food delivery alerts and grocery store promos, since Ridge had long stopped checking that inbox closely. 4 sentences, sent from a number he didn't recognize. I know you probably hate me. I get it. But you have no idea what it's been like here since everything happened. Things got out of hand, man. We're brothers. Ridge read it once. No apology in it. Not really. No mention of the letter still folded in his jacket pocket. The one that told Amina exactly how to perform her own remorse. Just a complaint about consequences, dressed up as an appeal to blood. He didn't reply, just added the screenshot to the folder, the one already holding a deacon board's silence, an insurance policy, a 6-month-old letter, and soon, 11 minutes and 42 seconds of his mother crying in a church pew. In its own clumsy way, it was the truest thing anyone from that family had said to him in over a year. Not an apology. Just an admission that he was already gone. The video came on a Thursday evening, forwarded through Ridge's attorney, who'd agreed to relay it just this once, after Evelyn called his office in tears for the better part of an hour. No note attached. One file. 11 minutes, 42 seconds. Ridge almost didn't open it, sat with the phone in his hand a long moment, porch light casting a soft yellow glow across the screen, Maha beside him, hand resting on his knee. Then he pressed play. It was Evelyn, sitting in a pew of the same Atlanta church she'd attended for 30 years, camera held by someone else, the frame slightly unsteady. She looked older than he remembered. Not just tired, worn through, the kind no amount of careful styling could hide. Her hands trembled in her lap. "Ridge, baby." Her voice cracked before she finished the sentence. "I know I was wrong." She kept talking, about the family's honor, about his nephew growing up without an uncle, about the church, the deacon board, the whispers following her into every room now. "If you don't come back," tears running freely, "this whole family is going to fall apart." It was the first time in over a year Evelyn Whitaker had said, "I was wrong," out loud, to anyone. Worth examining closely, this part. It sits right at the center of why this whole thing happened the way it did. Notice what's missing from Evelyn's apology. She never says what, specifically, she was wrong about. Not the secret meeting. Not the years of choosing Jamal's comfort over Ridge's right to the truth. Not the deacon board, used to silence the people trying to warn him. Therapists sometimes call this the specificity gap, the difference between an apology that names the exact harm and one that just performs the emotion of regret. A real apology says, I excluded you from a decision about your own life and let people call you broken to protect your brother. Evelyn's says only, I'm suffering now, please make it stop. Not the same sentence, even when the tears behind it are completely real. Ridge watched the whole thing without speaking. Maha watched it with him, hand still on his knee, saying nothing, just staying close. When it ended, the apartment went very quiet. They're not apologizing because they hurt me, Ridge finally said. Voice even, almost gentle. They're apologizing because they're hurting now. There's a name for what Evelyn's video represents, worth saying plainly, because plenty of families run on exactly this pattern without ever noticing it. Researchers call it consequence-driven contrition, remorse that only shows up once the cost of the original harm finally lands on the person who caused it, instead of staying confined to the person who suffered it. On the surface, it can look exactly like genuine accountability. The tears are often real. The desperation almost always is. What's missing is the one ingredient that would have made it matter. At no point does it ask what Ridge actually needed. It only asks what Evelyn needs from him, now that the cost has finally reached her. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Picked up his phone. Opened a message to his attorney. Typed 4 lines that closed the door for good. I have erased them from my life. Do not contact me again. Sent it. Then, because even a professional intermediary still counted as a thread tying him to that family, he asked his attorney to shut down the specific channel reserved for forwarding anything from the Whitakers. Kept open only the line still handling the last of his own unfinished legal business, the part that genuinely still belonged to him. He stood up from the couch, walked to the sliding glass door, stepped out onto the porch. The night air in Charlotte was cool, the faint metallic hum of the light rail a few blocks over. Ridge stood there a long moment, hands on the railing, looking at nothing in particular. He thought briefly of the man he used to be, the one who, without ever questioning it, called her my wife for 11 years. He searched for the old ache that thought used to bring. Wasn't there anymore. He took one slow breath, then another. For the first time in over a year, something settled in his chest he hadn't expected. Not victory, not even relief exactly. Something closer to weightlessness. The particular lightness of a man who's finally set down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten how heavy it was. Maha joined him a few minutes later, 2 mugs of tea in her hands. Just stood beside him without saying a word. Didn't ask if he was okay. Didn't need to. She could see it in the way his shoulders had finally, fully dropped. Here's what made this moment different from every other moment in this story. Ridge wasn't punishing his family by refusing to respond. He genuinely stopped needing anything from them. Not an apology, not an explanation, not even an acknowledgement of what they'd done. That's the quiet, almost invisible difference between someone still fighting a war and someone who simply, finally, walked off the battlefield. His silence wasn't a weapon anymore. Somewhere along the way, it had just become the sound of his own peace. Evelyn didn't know, sitting in that church pew with her phone still warm from recording, waiting for a reply that would never come, that Ridge's response would become the final blow that forced the rest of the family to face the consequences they'd spent over a year trying to outrun. Within days, word spread through the family. Ridge hadn't just declined to help. He'd ended it. Completely. Permanently. No negotiation. No second chance at reconciliation. No quiet phone call months later, softening with time, the way these things sometimes do. One last thing worth understanding before this story moves toward its ending. It explains why Evelyn's collapse, when it came, was so total. Families built around image instead of honesty often call their love unconditional. But the conditions are just hidden, not gone. Protect the favorite son. Keep up the appearance of unity. Never let the church see a crack. Evelyn had spent a lifetime believing she gave her children unconditional love, when really, she'd only ever offered conditional belonging. Ridge was the first person in the family with the clarity and the distance to finally tell the difference. For Evelyn, who'd built her whole identity around being the woman who held her family together, who'd sacrificed Ridge's trust to protect Jamal, who'd used her standing at church to bury the truth, who genuinely believed until the very last second that her tears would be enough to bring her favorite son home. This was the moment the floor finally gave way beneath her, completely. She'd spent a lifetime believing family meant unconditional forgiveness, freely given, no matter the cost to the people asked to provide it. She was about to learn, the hard way, exactly how wrong she'd been. What happens to the Whitaker family in the weeks after Ridge's final message is the hardest part of this story to watch. Stay with me. The consequences are only just beginning. Ridge and Maha married the following spring. A small ceremony in a garden venue just outside Charlotte. Folding chairs and string lights instead of a guest list that needed managing. Maha's family welcomed him the way families are supposed to. No conditions, no image to protect. Nobody pulling him aside to whisper about how things needed to look. Her mother hugged him at the reception and said simply, "We're glad you found your way to us." No further explanation. None needed. First family gathering in years where Ridge hadn't braced himself for something. The ceremony was small, 31 guests, folding white chairs in 2 careful rows under a pergola strung with lights. Late April air still carrying a faint chill that sent several of Maha's older relatives reaching for the cardigans they'd brought, just in case. The kind of gathering Ridge had quietly stopped believing he was allowed to have. Maha's grandmother, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Odessa who'd outlived 2 husbands and, by her own account, every single one of their excuses, pulled Ridge aside before the ceremony, straightened his boutonniere, a single sprig of rosemary for remembrance beside a small white rose, and studied him a long moment. "You don't talk much," she said, not a question. "No, ma'am." "Good. Talkers usually have something to cover up. You just keep showing up the way you have been. That's the only vow that matters in the end." She patted his cheek once, the way grandmothers do when they've decided something important and don't intend to discuss it further, and went to find her seat. When Maha walked toward him down the short grass aisle, late sun catching the edge of her dress, something moved in Ridge's chest he hadn't expected to feel again. Not relief, not even joy exactly. A kind of quiet astonishment. The feeling of a man who'd built an entirely new house and was only now, standing in the doorway, realizing it was actually meant to be lived in. The officiant, a longtime friend of Maha's family, kept it brief. No long readings, no elaborate symbolism, just 2 people promising, in plain language, to keep choosing each other on the ordinary days, not only the easy ones. At the reception, under the same string lights as the sun went down, Maha's youngest cousin, 8 years old, deeply unimpressed by the whole affair, asked Ridge with great seriousness whether he knew how to grill. Ridge admitted he was still learning. The boy considered this, nodded once, informed him this was an acceptable answer, and ran off toward the dessert table. Ridge laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere he'd nearly forgotten he had. Looked over at Maha, already watching him with the exact expression of someone who'd just witnessed the moment she'd been hoping for. During one of his final sessions with the therapist he'd been seeing quietly since arriving in Charlotte, Ridge said something he didn't fully understand until the words were already out. "I used to think family was something you had to protect at all costs. Now I know family is something you choose. And sometimes, walking away is the only way to keep yourself." His therapist didn't answer right away. Just let the sentence sit in the room, the way important sentences sometimes need to. Around this time, Maha told him something she'd been carrying quietly for months. "I knew," she admitted one evening, the two of them back on the porch, the same spot where so much of his healing had quietly happened. "Before we started dating seriously, Renee told me what happened. Warned me, actually. Told me not to get involved with the Whitaker family." Ridge looked at her, waiting. "I knew you'd been deeply betrayed," she continued. "But I could also see, almost right away, that you weren't the kind of man people could take advantage of anymore. Not after everything. I wanted to know that man, not the version of you they tried to keep small." He reached for her hand, said nothing for a while. Some things don't need a response, only acknowledgement. This is, in a lot of ways, the quiet center of the whole story. Ridge had spent over a year assuming his silence was just a wall, something built to keep pain out. What Maha's confession showed him was gentler. That same silence had also become a kind of filter, letting in only the people capable of seeing him clearly. No agenda, nothing needed from him he hadn't already chosen to give. Sometimes the boundaries we build to protect ourselves end up showing us, more clearly than we expected, exactly who deserves to be let back in. The updates from Atlanta came less often now, and Ridge stopped seeking them out. But one last email arrived through his attorney, the single line he'd kept open for the final pieces of his own case, weeks after the wedding, closing out the last thread of his old life. The Whitakers had lost the house in Inman Park, the one where Evelyn had hosted every holiday gathering for over 2 decades, to mounting legal and medical costs. Evelyn herself had entered a short-term psychiatric program after what her doctor called a severe stress-related breakdown. Ronald had suffered a mild stroke that spring, recovering slowly in a rehab facility outside Decatur. Amina, now divorced from Jamal too, was raising her son mostly alone, working 2 jobs to cover rent on a much smaller apartment than the one she'd once shared with Ridge. Ridge read the email once, didn't feel triumphant, felt something quieter, closer to confirmation than satisfaction. He hadn't built his new life to punish them. He'd built it because it was the only way he knew to stop being the person everyone else's stability depended on, at the cost of his own. That their stability collapsed without him in it wasn't his doing. It was simply the truth, finally, with nowhere left to hide. By early summer, Maha was expecting their first child. More evenings than not, Ridge found himself on the same porch where he'd once stood completely alone, cup of coffee in hand, watching Maha curled up on the swing with a book in her lap, the South End light rail humming faintly in the distance. Watching her there, he realized his silence had never really been about punishing the people who hurt him. It had simply been the way he chose, finally, to stop being a victim of his own family's expectations. And to start, quietly, without anyone's permission, building a life that was entirely his own. The following Saturday, he spent the afternoon assembling a crib in the spare room. Instructions spread across the floor, sunlight warm through the window, no family meetings to attend, no calls to dread, no version of himself to perform for anyone watching. Just a man, finally home, getting a room ready for the family he'd chosen. There's one more part of this story left. The part where Ridge finally lets go completely and finds out what real peace actually feels like. The phone rang on a quiet Tuesday evening. More than 3 years now since the night Ridge walked out of a house on Elizabeth Street with a duffel bag and a folded letter in his jacket pocket. Unknown number, Atlanta area code. Ridge looked at it a moment, sitting at the kitchen table, dinner smell still warm in the apartment, Maha humming softly somewhere down the hall. His pulse didn't quicken. None of that old, familiar tightness an Atlanta number used to bring. He just turned the phone over, screen down, let it ring out, then turned toward Maha, who'd just stepped into the doorway with their daughter balanced on her hip, and opened his arms. No drama in it, no speech, No final confrontation he'd secretly been waiting to deliver. Just the warmth of his wife and his daughter, and the quiet hum of a life he'd built entirely on his own terms. This, in the end, is the part of Ridge's story most people overlook. The part that happens after the courage, after the silence, after the consequences finally land on the people who earned them. It's simply this: peace, once you've truly built it, stops needing to be defended. Ridge no longer felt the need to explain his decision to anyone, not even to himself. No longer rehearsed what he might say if his mother ever called again. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped waiting for an ending that required their participation. He'd already written his own. In the months after, Ridge thought of his family less and less. Not bitterness, the way a person eventually stops thinking about a storm long after it's passed, and the skies just steadily stayed clear. He understood now something he hadn't been able to see clearly that first night in the kitchen on Elizabeth Street. Leaving hadn't only saved him, it had also forced his family, for the first time in their lives, to face the truth about who they really were. A truth they'd spent decades burying under church socials and carefully posed photographs, and the relentless need to look, from the outside, like a family that had never once failed each other. They couldn't outrun that forever. Eventually, with Ridge no longer there to absorb the weight of it, the truth found them on its own. 2 years later, Ridge Whittaker's life was stable in a way it had never been before. Not because nothing difficult had happened, because he'd finally stopped letting other people's chaos shape his own peace. He still went to the lab most mornings before the sun was fully up. Still came home to a porch light that was always, without fail, left on for him. Some evenings, sitting beside Maha with their daughter finally asleep down the hall, he'd just exhale and realize this was what he'd been building toward the whole time, long before he ever knew the shape it would take. This story teaches something more useful than stay strong. Try this instead. Keep a small spiral notebook on the kitchen counter, the $3 kind from the drugstore checkout line. Every Sunday evening, write down one person who showed up for you that week without being asked. No obligation, no guilt, just showed up. After 6 months, read the list back. That's your real family, named in your own handwriting. Next time someone who hurt you calls wanting to talk it through, don't hang up out of anger. Just ask yourself one quiet question first. Has anything actually changed, or are they only uncomfortable now? Let that answer decide, not your history with them. And the porch light. Leave it burning only for the people who would have left theirs on for you, too. Thank you for spending this time with Ridge's story. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement so that timeless lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up against wrong could move and educate viewers everywhere. Production team story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Wynn. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Wynn. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.